The sharp rip of duct tape echoed through the stunned silence of the Meadowbrook Community Center auditorium. 3 children stood frozen on stage, silver tape pressed firmly across their mouths, their eyes wide with shock and humiliation. Karen Whitmore, the Homeowners Association Entertainment Coordinator, held the roll of tape like a weapon, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping it with the authority of someone who had never been told no. "You're too big to sing," she announced to the horrified audience of parents and children, her voice cutting through the air with surgical precision. "This is supposed to be a talent show, not a circus act." The gasps that followed seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room. Parents half rose from their seats, mouths opening in disbelief, while children shrank deeper into their chairs. The 3 victims on stage, Emma Rodriguez, age 9, Marcus Thompson, 11, and little Sophie Chen, barely 8, stood paralyzed, tears streaming down their cheeks around the edges of the tape. In the front row, a man in a navy suit leaned forward slightly, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. His partner beside him placed a gentle hand on his arm, but her own face had gone ashen. Neither moved to identify themselves, but their presence would prove to be the catalyst that would bring Karen's reign of terror to a spectacular end. Just 30 minutes earlier, the Meadowbrook Community Center had buzzed with the excited energy that only a children's talent show could generate. The annual summer fundraiser had become a beloved tradition, with proceeds going to the local food bank and children's literacy program. Parents clutched phones ready to capture their little ones' moments of glory, while grandparents settled into folding chairs with proud smiles already painted across their faces. The stage had been decorated with colorful streamers and balloons, courtesy of the volunteer committee that had worked tirelessly for weeks to ensure everything was perfect. A professional sound system had been rented, complete with wireless microphones and stage lighting that cast a warm glow across the performance area. The air smelled of popcorn from the concession stand and the faint trace of cleaning supplies that lingered from the morning's preparations. Karen had arrived precisely at 6 o'clock, her signature clipboard in one hand and a designer handbag slung over her shoulder. At 43, she maintained the kind of rigid perfection that came from years of controlling every aspect of her environment. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe chignon, not a strand out of place despite the summer humidity. Her navy blazer and matching skirt screamed authority, while her 4-inch heels clicked against the linoleum floor with military precision. She had been the HOA's entertainment coordinator for 3 years, a position she had campaigned for with the fervor of someone running for mayor. Her vision for community events centered around what she called maintaining standards, a phrase that had become synonymous with her name throughout the neighborhood. Previous events under her leadership had been notable for their strict adherence to her personal aesthetic preferences and her uncanny ability to make participants feel as though they were auditioning for her approval rather than simply having fun. The talent show roster had been her particular obsession for weeks. She had reviewed each child's registration form with the thoroughness of a college admissions officer, making notes about presentation potential and audience appeal. Several parents had received phone calls suggesting their children might be better suited for backstage roles or the refreshment committee. But 3 names had particularly caught her attention, and not in a positive way. Emma Rodriguez had registered to sing "What a Wonderful World," a choice that had made her mother, Maria, beam with pride. Emma had been taking voice lessons for 2 years and had a remarkably mature tone for her age. She was also what Karen categorized as significantly overweight, a fact that had been noted in red ink on her registration form. Marcus Thompson, an enthusiastic 5th grader, had signed up to perform a spoken word piece he had written about friendship and acceptance. His teacher had encouraged him to share it after he had moved his entire class to tears during a school assembly. Marcus was a gentle giant for his age, tall and broad, with a sensitivity that made him a favorite among his peers and teachers alike. Sophie Chen, the youngest of the three, had chosen to sing "You Are My Sunshine" because it reminded her of her grandmother, who had recently passed away. Her parents, David and Lisa, had hesitated to sign her up, knowing their daughter was self-conscious about her size. But Sophie had insisted with the determination that only an 8-year-old could muster. All three children shared one common characteristic that had drawn Karen's disapproval: they were overweight. In her mind, this made them unsuitable for public performance, a liability to the event's visual appeal, and a potential source of embarrassment for the entire community. As families filed into the auditorium that evening, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Children bounced in their seats, while parents chatted with neighbors, creating the warm buzz of community that made these events special. The performers waited backstage, some nervously rehearsing their acts, while others giggled with excitement. Karen made her rounds, checking sound levels, adjusting decorations, and offering last-minute instructions to the volunteer ushers. To casual observers, she appeared to be the picture of dedicated organization, but those who knew her well could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes, and the manner in which her gaze lingered critically on certain participants. The show began promptly at 7 o'clock, with Karen taking the stage to welcome the audience. Her opening remarks were polished and professional, thanking sponsors and volunteers while outlining the evening's charitable goals. She introduced each act with practiced enthusiasm. Though careful observers might have noticed the subtle differences in her tone, the slight pause before certain names, the forced brightness in her voice when introducing performers, she clearly viewed as problematic. The first half of the show proceeded smoothly. A group of teenagers performed a choreographed dance routine that earned thunderous applause. Twin sisters played a piano duet that left several parents wiping away tears. A 10-year-old magician successfully made a rubber ball disappear, only to find it behind his own ear, sending the younger children into fits of delighted laughter. But as the intermission ended and the second half began, Karen's demeanor shifted noticeably. Emma, Marcus, and Sophie were all scheduled to perform in the final portion of the evening, and their approaching stage time seemed to fill Karen with increasing agitation. She paced behind the backdrop, muttering to herself and adjusting her clipboard with unnecessary frequency. When Emma's name was called, the 9-year-old walked onto the stage with the quiet confidence that had made her voice teacher proud. She wore a simple yellow dress that her mother had spent weeks choosing, and her hair was pulled back with a matching ribbon. As she took her position at the microphone, her smile was radiant, completely unaware of the storm brewing in Karen's mind. But before Emma could even begin her song, Karen appeared on stage with swift, decisive movements that caught everyone off guard. Her heels clicked against the wooden floor like gunshots in the suddenly tense atmosphere. "I'm sorry," Karen announced, her voice carrying easily through the sound system, "but we need to make some adjustments to tonight's program." The audience stirred uneasily, confused by the interruption. Emma looked between Karen and the audience, her confidence beginning to waver as she sensed something was terribly wrong. "Some of our performers tonight," Karen continued, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used during HOA meetings, "are not suitable for this type of presentation. Their appearance would draw ridicule and ruin the optics of what should be a dignified community event." A collective intake of breath rippled through the auditorium. Parents exchanged alarmed glances while children looked to their families for explanation. Emma's face began to crumble as the meaning of Karen's words sank in. "Mrs. Whitmore," called Maria Rodriguez from the audience, her voice shaking with controlled fury. "What exactly are you saying?" Karen turned to face the audience with the calm certainty of someone who believed herself to be absolutely in the right. I'm saying that some children simply aren't cut out for public performance. When physical appearance becomes a distraction from the art itself, we have a responsibility to make difficult decisions. The auditorium erupted in scattered murmurs and protests. But Karen raised her hand for silence with the imperious gesture of a traffic cop. "Emma, dear," she said, turning back to the trembling child. "You have a lovely voice. But let's be honest about what the audience sees when they look at you. This is about maintaining the quality and dignity of our community events." Before anyone could process what was happening, Karen reached into her handbag and pulled out a roll of silver duct tape. The sight of it sent a chill through the room, though no one could have predicted what would happen next. "Since you insist on participating despite my guidance," Karen said, her voice eerily calm, "perhaps we can find a way to minimize the disruption you'll cause." With movement so quick and assured, they seemed rehearsed. Karen stepped forward and pressed a piece of tape across Emma's mouth. The child's eyes went wide with shock and humiliation, her hands instinctively reaching up toward her face before falling helplessly to her sides. The auditorium exploded into chaos. Parents leaped to their feet, shouting protests and demands for explanation. Children began crying, some from confusion and others from the raw horror of what they were witnessing. But Karen was not finished. "Marcus, Sophie," she called toward the backstage area. "You might as well come out here too. Let's address this situation all at once." The two children emerged from behind the backdrop, their faces already streaked with tears as they had watched their friend's humiliation from the wings. Marcus, despite his size and age, looked smaller than ever as he approached the center of the stage. Sophie's tiny frame shook with sobs that could be heard even over the growing din from the audience. "You see?" Karen announced to the crowd, her voice rising above the protests. "This is exactly the kind of disruption I was trying to prevent. These children's appearance creates chaos and takes attention away from the real talent we're here to celebrate." With mechanical efficiency, she applied tape to Marcus's mouth, then Sophie's, creating a tableau of cruelty that would be seared into the memory of everyone present. The three children stood side by side, their voices literally silenced, their dignity stripped away in front of their entire community. "There," Karen said, stepping back to admire her work like an artist pleased with a painting. "Now perhaps we can return to the actual purpose of this evening without further distractions." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the protesters had momentarily been struck speechless by the sheer audacity and cruelty of what they had witnessed. In that frozen moment, the only sounds were the muffled sobs of the three children and the subtle creak of folding chairs as audience members shifted in their seats. But, in the front row, two figures had not spoken throughout the entire ordeal. The man in the navy suit had remained perfectly still, his face a mask of controlled fury. His partner, a woman with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, had one hand pressed to her mouth in horror while the other gripped her husband's arm. The man was Dr. James Chen, superintendent of the district's school system. The woman beside him was his husband, Dr. Patricia Chen, a clinical psychologist who specialized in childhood trauma. And the little girl on stage with tape across her mouth, she was their adopted daughter, Sophie. They had come to the talent show incognito, wanting to enjoy Sophie's performance without the attention that their positions in the community might draw. Sophie had begged them not to make a big deal of their attendance, wanting her moment on stage to be about her, not about who her parents were. They had agreed, settling into seats in the front row where they could record her performance while remaining relatively unnoticed. Now, as they watched their daughter's dignity being systematically destroyed by a woman drunk on her own authority. Their professional restraint was being tested to its absolute limits. Dr. James Chen had built his reputation on fairness, measured responses, and educational leadership that prioritized the well-being of every child in his district. He had dealt with difficult parents, problematic teachers, and complex administrative challenges with the kind of steady wisdom that had earned him respect throughout the state. But nothing in his career had prepared him for watching his own child be publicly humiliated and silenced. Dr. Patricia Chen had spent her career helping children recover from trauma, teaching them to find their voices again after experiences that had robbed them of their sense of safety and self-worth. She understood better than most the psychological damage that could result from public humiliation, especially for children who were already vulnerable due to societal prejudices about their appearance. Together, they made a decision that would change the trajectory of not just this evening, but of their entire community's understanding of accountability and justice. Dr. James Chen stood slowly, his movement deliberate and controlled. The action drew Karen's attention away from her victims, and she turned toward him with the expectant look of someone anticipating either applause or acquiescence. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that could silence a room full of arguing school board members. "I believe you need to remove that tape from those children immediately." Karen's eyebrows rose in surprise at being challenged so directly. She was accustomed to parents who might grumble or complain, but ultimately deferred to her authority in matters of event management. "Sir, I appreciate your concern," she replied with the condescending tone she reserved for parents who didn't understand the bigger picture. "But I'm the coordinator of this event, and I'm making executive decisions in the best interest of everyone present." "No," Dr. Chen said, taking a step forward. You're publicly abusing children, and it stops now." The word abuse seemed to electrify the room. Parents who had been murmuring among themselves fell silent, while others began pulling out phones to record what was quickly becoming a confrontation of historic proportions for their small community. Karen's face flushed red, but her voice remained steady. "I don't know who you think you are, but you don't get to waltz in here and tell me how to run my event. These children's parents signed permission forms. They agreed to participate knowing full well what that entailed. I don't think they agreed to having their children publicly humiliated and physically restrained." Dr. Patricia Chen interjected, rising to stand beside her husband. "What you've done here constitutes assault against minors." Karen laughed, the sound sharp and brittle in the tense atmosphere. "Assault? That's ridiculous. I'm trying to save these children from embarrassment and protect the reputation of this community. Someone has to make the hard decisions around here." "The only person who should be embarrassed," Dr. James Chen said, his voice growing stronger, "is you. Remove that tape. Now." "And just who exactly do you think you are to give me orders?" Karen demanded, her composure finally beginning to crack. "Some random parent who doesn't like my management style?" The question hung in the air for a moment, creating a dramatic pause that seemed to stretch into infinity. Dr. Chen looked at his daughter, still standing on stage with tears streaming down her face. Then, back at Karen with an expression that could have frozen water. "I'm Dr. James Chen," he said clearly, his words carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent auditorium. "Superintendent of this school district, and that's my daughter you've just assaulted." The collective gasp from the audience was audible this time, a sharp intake of breath from dozens of people as the implications of this revelation crashed over them like a wave. Karen's face went through a spectacular range of colors, from red to white to a sickly green as she processed what she had just heard. "And I, Doctor," Patricia Chen added, her voice carrying the steel of someone who had spent years advocating for vulnerable children. "Am Dr. Patricia Chen, licensed clinical psychologist and consultant to the State Department of Child Services. What you've done here tonight will be reported to every relevant authority, and you will face the full consequences of your actions." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Karen's clipboard hitting the floor as her hands went limp with shock. The authority she had wielded so confidently just moments before evaporated like morning mist, leaving her standing alone on the stage beside three children whose lives she had just altered forever. "Doctor," Chen moved with purpose toward the stage, his wife close behind. But before they could reach their daughter, another voice cut through the tension. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from those children." The voice belonged to Officer Michael Rodriguez, Emma's uncle, who had been sitting in the back of the auditorium in plain clothes. Having come straight from his shift to support his niece's performance, he was now moving down the aisle with the measured pace of law enforcement, his badge visible on his belt despite his civilian attire. "This is a citizen's arrest for assault against minors," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of his profession. "You have the right to remain silent." Karen's world was collapsing with cinematic thoroughness. Within the span of 5 minutes, she had gone from being the powerful coordinator of a community event to facing arrest, professional consequences, and the wrath of not just angry parents, but the most influential educational leaders in the district. "Wait," she stammered, finally finding her voice as the full magnitude of her situation became clear. "I can explain. This is all a misunderstanding. I was just trying to maintain standards, to protect the integrity of the event." But her words fell on ears that had already heard enough. Dr. Chen had reached the stage and was gently removing the tape from Sophie's mouth, his hands shaking slightly as he felt the adhesive's resistance against her tender skin. Dr. Patricia was doing the same for Emma, while Marcus's parents had rushed from their seats to tend to their son. "Daddy," Sophie whispered, as soon as her mouth was free, her voice small and confused. "Why did she do that to us?" The question pierced through the adult complexities of authority and consequence to the simple, heartbreaking core of what had happened. Children had been hurt by an adult who was supposed to protect them. Dr. Chen knelt to his daughter's eye level, his professional composure finally cracking as he saw the confusion and pain in her eyes. "She made a very bad choice, sweetheart. But it's over now, and she's going to face consequences for what she did." Officer Rodriguez had reached the stage and was placing handcuffs on Karen, who had gone completely limp with shock. Her earlier bravado had evaporated entirely, leaving behind a woman who seemed to suddenly understand that actions have consequences, even for those who consider themselves untouchable. "The show is over," Dr. Chen announced to the audience, his voice carrying easily through the sound system that was still active. "These children have been through enough trauma for one evening. We'll be in touch with all families about rescheduling and addressing what happened here tonight." But Emma Rodriguez, despite everything she had endured, stepped forward with a courage that silenced the auditorium once again. "I still want to sing," she said, her voice small but determined. "She can't stop me from singing." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, a thunderous sound that seemed to wash away some of the evening's horror and replace it with something approaching healing. Emma's mother, Maria, was crying openly as she nodded her permission from the audience. And so, as Karen was led away in handcuffs, as parents comforted their traumatized children, as the community grappled with what they had witnessed, a 9-year-old girl stepped up to the microphone and began to sing "What a Wonderful World," with a voice that carried more power and beauty than anyone in that room had expected. Her performance was flawless, her voice clear and strong, carrying Louis Armstrong's hopeful lyrics to every corner of the auditorium. But more than that, it was an act of defiance against cruelty, a refusal to be silenced or diminished by someone else's prejudice. Marcus and Sophie joined her for the final verse, their voices blending together in harmony as they reclaimed their right to be heard, to be seen, to take up space in the world without apology. The standing ovation that followed lasted for nearly 10 minutes, with audience members cheering not just for the performance, but for the courage these children had shown in the face of unthinkable treatment. The aftermath of that evening would unfold over the following weeks and months, like chapters in a book about justice and accountability. Karen Whitmore was formally charged with 3 counts of assault against minors, public humiliation of children, and abuse of authority. The charges were serious enough to warrant significant legal consequences, including fines, community service, and a permanent ban from working with children in any capacity. Her position as HOA Entertainment Coordinator was terminated immediately, along with her membership on several community boards. The Homeowners Association issued a public apology and implemented new policies requiring sensitivity training for all volunteers working with children. The talent show was rescheduled 2 weeks later as a celebration of body positivity and inclusive community values. Emma, Marcus, and Sophie were featured as the evening's headline performers, and their story had attracted regional media attention that brought visitors from neighboring communities. Dr. James Chen used the incident as a catalyst for district-wide policy changes regarding bullying and discrimination. New protocols were implemented to protect students from adult authority figures who might abuse their positions, and mandatory training was instituted for all staff members on recognizing and preventing discrimination based on physical appearance. Dr. Patricia Chen began working with all 3 children and their families to address the trauma they had experienced. Her professional assessment concluded that while the incident had been deeply harmful, the community's response, the immediate support, the consequences for the perpetrator, and the celebration of the children's courage would likely prevent long-term psychological damage. Officer Rodriguez commended the parents and community members who had documented the incident on their phones, noting that the video evidence had been crucial in building a strong case against Karen. He also praised the children for their resilience and the adults who had stepped forward to protect them. The local newspaper ran a series of articles about the incident, focusing not just on Karen's actions, but on the broader issues of discrimination and the importance of community accountability. Letters to the editor poured in from parents, educators, and community leaders, all expressing support for the children and condemning the behavior they had witnessed. Emma Rodriguez became something of a local celebrity, receiving invitations to perform at other community events, and even being asked to sing the national anthem at a minor league baseball game. Her confidence, which could have been shattered by Karen's cruelty, instead seemed to grow stronger with each performance. Marcus Thompson began working with a local spoken word group, sharing his poetry at events focused on acceptance and anti-bullying. His piece about the talent show experience, titled "The Power of Voice," became a viral sensation when it was shared on social media, earning him recognition from young poets across the country. Sophie Chen, with the support of her parents and Dr. Patricia's professional guidance, processed her experience through art therapy and music. She continued performing, but more importantly, she learned that her worth was not determined by other people's opinions about her appearance. The 3 families formed a bond that extended well beyond the shared trauma of that evening. They organized regular playdates, supported each other at subsequent performances, and became advocates for other children who faced discrimination based on their appearance. The Meadowbrook Community Center installed a plaque near the entrance commemorating the evening and the children's courage. It reads, "In honor of Emma, Marcus, and Sophie, who reminded us that every voice deserves to be heard and every child deserves to be celebrated." Karen Whitmore served her community service at a local food bank, where she was required to work under supervision and complete sensitivity training. The experience was reportedly humbling for someone who had previously viewed herself as above the people she was now serving alongside. Her social media accounts, which had previously been filled with posts about maintaining community standards and property values, went silent. Neighbors reported that she kept a much lower profile, avoiding community events and seeming to understand that her reputation in Meadowbrook had been permanently altered. The incident became a case study in several college courses on community leadership and child psychology, illustrating how quickly authority can be abused and how important it is for communities to have systems in place to protect vulnerable members. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on the community itself. The residents of Meadowbrook had witnessed something that forced them to examine their own biases and assumptions. They had seen how quickly a person in authority could abuse that power. And they had also seen how quickly a community could come together to protect its most vulnerable members. The annual talent show continued in subsequent years, but with new policies ensuring that all participants were welcomed and celebrated regardless of their appearance, ability level, or background. The event grew in popularity, drawing families from across the region who had heard about the community that stood up for its children. Emma, Marcus, and Sophie continued to perform, but they also became advocates for other children who faced discrimination. They spoke at schools, community centers, and conferences about the importance of inclusion and the power of standing up to bullies, even when those bullies are adults in positions of authority. Their story became a testament to the fact that courage comes in all sizes and ages, and that sometimes the most powerful voice in the room belongs to a child who refuses to be silenced. Years later, when the three of them had grown into confident teenagers, they would still gather each summer for the anniversary of that night. They would remember not just the cruelty they had experienced, but the love and support that had surrounded them in its aftermath. They would remember the sound of their voices joining together in harmony, singing Louis Armstrong's lyrics about seeing blue skies and red roses, and thinking to themselves what a wonderful world it could be when people chose kindness over cruelty, inclusion over exclusion, and love over fear. And they would remember that sometimes. The most important moments in our lives come not from the people who try to silence us, but from our decision to keep singing anyway. The talent show scandal, as it came to be known, served as a watershed moment for Meadowbrook and the surrounding communities. It demonstrated that accountability was possible, that justice could prevail, and that all children's voices deserve to be heard, celebrated, and protected. In the end, Karen Whitmore's attempt to silence three children had instead amplified their voices beyond anything she could have imagined. Her moment of cruelty had become their launching pad to advocacy. Her abuse of power had strengthened their community's resolve to protect its vulnerable members. And her tape had ultimately been no match for the unbreakable power of the human spirit to sing, to speak, and to be heard. The wonderful world that Emma sang about that night was not just a lyrical aspiration. It had become a concrete goal that their community was working toward. One voice, one child, one moment of courage at a time.